chapter 1. Ecclesiastes chapter 1. I'll go ahead and read through the chapter here. It says, verse 1, the words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. Vanity of vanities, saith the preacher, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. What profit hath a man of all his labor which he taketh under the sun? One generation passeth away, and another generation cometh, but the earth abideth forever. The sun also ariseth, and the sun goeth down, and hasteth to his place where he rose. The wind goeth toward the south, and turneth about to the north. It whirleth about continually, and the wind returneth again according to his circuits. All the rivers run into the sea, yet the sea is not full. Unto the place from whence the rivers came, thither they return again. All things are full of labor. Man cannot utter it. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor the ear filled with hearing. The thing that hath been, it is that which shall be. And that which is done is that which shall be done. And there is no new thing under the sun. Is there anything whereof it may be said, see, this is new, it hath been already of old time, which was before us? There is no remembrance of former things, neither shall there be any remembrance of things that are to come with those that shall come after. I, the preacher, was king over Israel and Jerusalem, and I gave my heart to seek and to search out by wisdom concerning all things that are done under heaven. This sore travail hath God given to the sons of man to be exercised therewith. I have seen all the works that are done under the sun, and behold, all is vanity and vexation of spirit. That which is crooked cannot be made straight, and that which is wanting cannot be numbered. I communed with mine own heart, saying, Lo, I am come to great estate, and have gotten more wisdom than all that are before me in Jerusalem. Yea, my heart had great experience of wisdom and knowledge, and I gave my heart to know wisdom, and to know madness and folly. I perceived that this also is vexation of spirit. For in much wisdom is much grief, and he that increaseth knowledge increaseth sorrow. And so, we begin here with this very complex, perplexing book. And so here in chapter 1, it opens with the author introducing himself as the preacher. Now that word there, and I think I mentioned this in the introduction last week, but that word is the Hebrew word kohelet. Sometimes it's spelled koheleth, but it's a Hebrew word, and it refers to kind of someone who gathers. And like I mentioned last week, here he is gathering for the purposes of imparting wisdom. And so the whole book really is the sermon or the speech or the lesson of the preacher, this teacher, this man. And it makes sense when you consider, again, I'm working off the assumption that Solomon is the author. And so it makes sense when you understand Solomon now as an older man, having experienced the life that he experienced with the wisdom that he had, now trying to take that and impart that to particularly a younger generation. And we'll see that towards more the end of the book, but he does specifically kind of call out younger people. But it's the life of this man trying to give wisdom for others to learn from it. And so that's what the whole book is. And so the main point, one of the main points, I guess I should say, that the preacher wants us to know is summed up in verse 2. And probably verse 2 is probably the most well-known verse in the whole book. But vanity of vanities, saith the preacher, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. And so this is, he doesn't waste any time. He gets right into his point here, and everything is going to flow out from this. But this is what he wants people to, this is what he's hitting them with to begin with. Now, as we talked about last week, he's building to a point. And we're going to see snippets of that even in this particular chapter. But he's building to something, but he really hits you with this kind of shocking, attention-grabbing thought, right? This isn't, if Solomon were here and he just said, everybody gather around, I have some wisdom I want to impart, and then that's how he began, that's not what we would expect. It would be a shocking statement. And so it's, again, he's grabbing your attention early. Now, throughout the book, and just kind of to note this since it's first brought up here, throughout the book, the term or the word vanity or vain or vanities, it's used three different ways. And so it's referring to either, and sometimes there's a combination, it's referring to either things that are fleeting and temporary. It's referring to things that are just purposeless, meaningless, have no ultimate meaning, or things that are unknowable. I've studied this, I've searched this, I've spent my life dedicated to this, and ultimately it's just something that surpasses knowledge. It's unknowable. Well, here the preacher points us to the meaninglessness of life, that ultimately a life has no ultimate purpose. Now, he's going to put some parameters on that, and so just hold on for a second. But this is the point that he's opening up with, right? Everything is vanity. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. And so essentially, even the best that life can offer, right? Solomon would even say, families and love and joy and mirth and all the things, that we would say are kind of the best of life, right? Solomon would sum that up the same way. It's all vanity. To quote Robert Lauren, he said, "It appears to imply here both that which is transitory and that which is futile." And so he kind of combines a couple of those meanings. But he says this, and this is where I really agree with him. It emphasizes how swiftly earthly things pass away and how little they offer while one has them. Right? And then he gives the reference there of James 4, which is talking about the vapor that appears for a little time, And so this is how, and it's an interesting thing, because if somebody were to ask us to define life, right? What are the best things in life? Probably the text we're not going to go to is James 4. But this is how Solomon describes this. It's just vanity. It's fleeting. It doesn't last. It has no purpose. However, and this is something you really have to understand in order to get the book of Ecclesiastes. And so he comes to this thought, which he calls under the sun. Okay, and this is a phrase, either that one directly or something similar to it, that he's going to use constantly throughout the book. And so he places parameters around this observation. And so the main observation that he takes away is that everything is vain. All is vanity. But then he kind of places some parentheses around that, okay? And so because if we were to take that to mean literally everything, then one could say, well, living a life of godliness is vain, right? Living a life of faith is vain. Believing in God is vain. Obeying the Scriptures is vain, right? If we were to take that away, there are things that we know ultimately are not vain. We would have to say that Solomon is now defining them as, and so he places some parameters around that. And so here's what he does, and this is in verse 3. He says, "What profiteth the man of all his labor which he taketh under the sun?" That's an important phrase in the book of Ecclesiastes, under the sun. And so this phrase, that exact phrase, under the sun, is used 29 times in the book. Later on in this chapter, he'll refer to that which is under heaven. Well, that's the same thing, under the sun. And so here's what he's doing. Under the sun is kind of Solomon's way of describing the worldview of the secularist. And I'm going to come back to that thought in just a moment. But to go back to last week when we were introducing the book, Solomon's whole premise is that life is vain outside of a life lived for God, right? And so that's his premise. Now he gets to it in a odd way, and it's mostly seen kind of in chapter 12. But even here, when he talks about things that are done under the sun, that's kind of Solomon's way of saying that is the life lived without, or not at least for, God. Okay, and so I'll come back to the thought in just a second, but it is under the sun where he gives this long list of things that when you read through it, you kind of think, well, man, Solomon, you're being real down. You're kind of being kind of a bummer right now. But under the sun is where he sees no profit. Okay, so it is under the sun where one generation comes, passes away, and then is replaced by the next, but the world just keeps spinning. Right, and so, and this is everything he says is true, right? I mean, there is a generation here today, gone tomorrow. The next one rises up, and then so on and so forth. But the world is still going. The world is still spinning. Everything is still going as it has. And so, he sees this and he says, well, there's vanity there. And then the next thing, under the sun, this is where the course of nature happens. The sun, the wind, the water, they all follow kind of their course, right? The sun rises and it sets, and at least the way that we look at it, of course, we understand it's not really rising and setting. It's how we're spinning in relation to it. But nevertheless, the sun rises, it sets. The rivers flow. There's the water cycle. The wind blows, but it goes in a cycle. All of that is happening in its course. And then there's the eye and the ear. We constantly see, we constantly hear, and yet we never think, I've seen enough, I've heard enough, I'm fulfilled, right? We want to see more. We want to hear more. And then he goes on to kind of another very well-known and familiar passage of Ecclesiastes, which is there's nothing new under the sun. Right? And so even at the end of the day, even if you think you have some grand new invention, that's not really new. Now just to, I don't want to break the flow of the argument here, but just to set as an aside here, when Solomon says there's nothing new under the sun, we can't take that as absolute in its application to say that, we have phones in our pockets that absolutely didn't exist when Solomon wrote this. But ultimately, what is he saying? Technology may grow and our understanding of technology may get better, but ultimately it's allowing us to do things that we've always done. We're just doing old things in new ways, right? And so at the end of the day, you can ultimately say there's nothing new under the sun. And so all of this, he takes this all together. Verse 10, is there anything whereof it may be said, see, this is new? He says, it hath been already of old time, which it was before. There is no remembrance of former things, neither shall there be any remembrance of things that are to come with those that shall come after. And so all of these things are taking place. Nothing is ultimately remembered. There's very few. I mean, you think of all the people who have ever lived. There's very few who are actually remembered, right? When we consider all the events that have taken place since the world began, there are very few that are actually remembered. And so Solomon is just thinking about this. He's going, and what does he come away with? He comes away with all is vanity. But again, remember, all is vanity under the sun. And so it might seem bleak until you understand the perspective from which Solomon here is writing. And I'll quote, he says it well, so I'll just quote G.S. Henry here. Speaking about the book as a whole, he says, its apparent worldliness is dictated by its aim. Kohelet is addressing the general public whose view is bounded by the horizons of this world. He meets them on their own ground and proceeds to convict them of its inherent vanity. This is further borne out by his characteristic expression under the sun, by which he describes what the New Testament calls the world. His book is in fact a critique of secularism and of secularized religion. Secularism essentially just being that which is done in the world outside of a worldview that considers God. And so the secular worldview wants to use human intuition. It wants to use human philosophies. It wants to use all of our own understandings of the world to explain the world without God. Now here's the thing. That's impossible because you can't explain the world without God in a world that God created. And so this is why it might seem bleak, because it's a bleak worldview. It's a bleak worldview. If I were to take the message of Ecclesiastes, and instead of writing it to the secularist, let's say I was writing it to the atheist, instead of saying all things are vanity under the sun, I might say something along the lines of all things are vanity in a godless creation or in a godless existence. And so this is what Solomon is doing. Does it seem bleak? Yes, intentionally so. Intentionally so. Because Solomon is trying to get them to understand, outside of a world in which you are living faithfully for the God who created you, everything is vain. That nothing does matter. Ultimately, you are going to die and be separate from that God. Now, that might be what you think you want now. It will not be what you want then when you finally come to realize the fullness of what that all entails. But Ecclesiastes is written in such a way to be intentionally, intentionally dark. I mean, it is kind of a bleak and dark and somber book. And again, it's written that way on purpose because he's trying to get them to see, here's the ultimate aim of your worldview. This is the ultimate end of where your worldview takes you. And it's the same for secularists today. It's the same for the atheists today. It's the same for anybody who tries, like I said, to use human reasoning, which is really philosophy, to use philosophy to try and explain without God a world in which God created. Right? This is the end of it. And so Ecclesiastes then really becomes an important book for the modern time where secularism is on the rise. Right? I mean, and I know globally speaking, this may have been so for a long time, but especially here in the West, secularism is gaining a lot of popularity. And so Ecclesiastes is becoming quite a relevant, not that it's never not been relevant, but it's becoming very more relevant in Western society. And so in verse 12, the second half, I guess you could say, of chapter 1, I, the preacher, was king over Israel and Jerusalem. It says, and I gave my heart to seek and search out by wisdom concerning all things that are done under heaven. And he says, this sore travail hath God given to the sons of men to be exercised therewith. I'm going to end with that. Okay, I'm going to come back to that thought. I have seen all the works that are done under the sun, and he comes back to it again. Behold, all is vanity and vexation of spirit. But again, what is? That which is done under the sun. And so Solomon here begins to explain his own experience with life, with the earth, with the creation. I gave my heart to seek and search out by wisdom. And so here Solomon, the wisest man that's ever lived, says, I tried to figure out the earth using your worldview. Again, your meaning the secularist, using your worldview. I looked at the world through your eyes. And here's what I found. All is vanity. All is vexation of spirit. He uses, what an incredible verse. The verse 15, he says, here's where your worldview is. That which is crooked cannot be made straight, and that which is wanting cannot be numbered. You can't put a square peg in a round hole, right? And here's what he's trying to say. You're trying to, and again, this is exactly what's happening in universities and higher learning and places all over the world today. You're trying to cram a godless worldview, your square peg, into the round hole that God created. It doesn't work. It doesn't fit. And why do you think people are so miserable? Because they're trying to do what doesn't work. They're trying to make fit what doesn't fit. And so Solomon pursued this wisdom, this great wisdom. He said he pursued this greater than all they that have come before me in Jerusalem. Now, again, just as an aside, we talked about this a little bit last week. This is one of the verses why people think Solomon didn't write the book. Because he says, I've done this more than all they that have come before me in Jerusalem. Again, admittedly, an odd way to express what would probably, in the most straightforward reading of this, be referring to only David. However, by saying all they that have come before me in Jerusalem, I think probably what he's doing is he's referencing all the rulers of Jerusalem, going all the way back to Melchizedek, right? Not just David, not just kings of Israel, but everyone who has ever ruled Jerusalem. And so, again, this is, I don't see this as a kind of a proof text that Solomon was not the author. And so he thrust himself at the problems of life, like I said, trying to do it how they do it, with all of the human intellect one could offer, and he's doing it in the shoes of the wisest man who's ever lived. However, it too left him with no benefit, because he says, he that increaseth knowledge increaseth sorrow. Even the more wisdom Solomon attained, the more he tried to search for the intricacies and curiosities and mysteries of the world around him, to try and do so without God, the more knowledge he gained, the more sorrowful it left him. To quote Leupold, he said, the closest analogy to the experiment here described would in our day be an honest attempt to solve all problems and to attain to all knowledge by the processes of rational thinking. It would be the philosopher's attempt to probe into the depth of matters by his unaided and unenlightened reason, apart from any disclosures of truth that God has granted to man. Now, God absolutely wants us to use intellect. God absolutely wants us to use rational thinking, to use logic. And he wants us to think through things in an appropriate manner, to use the mind that God has given to us. But when we're doing that, and I know I've said this already a couple times, but when we're trying to do that without acknowledging the existence of the one who gave us that mind, we're blocking out all attempts to find what actual truth is. And so this, it makes, when you read through this book and you have that understanding, that when Solomon refers to that which is under the sun, he's referring to it from through the lens of the secularist. It makes a whole lot of sense why we're seeing a whole lot of the suffering that we see today, while we're seeing a lot of the mindset and the depression, right? I mean, we've talked about this before. I've said we live in the Prozac era, right, where everybody's depressed and everybody. Well, why are they? Because this is what's being taught. not the book of Ecclesiastes, but this worldview that Solomon's speaking against. And so it makes sense why people are so confused, why people are so depressed, because they're starting with without the key to the puzzle that they're trying to answer, and they're left without any satisfactory truth or any satisfactory answers. Now I said I was going to come back to this because I think, at least for me, as I was studying this, the most surprising part of this chapter, once you kind of understand that what Solomon means by under the sun, the most surprising part of this chapter to me was found in verse 13. And so he says, I gave my heart to seek and to search out by wisdom concerning all things that are done under heaven. And then he says this sore travail hath God given to the sons of man to be exercised therewith. And so here Solomon is spending all this time, and by no means are we done. We'll see it as we go throughout the book. But spending all this time speaking about the vanity of the search, or at least the answers that it led him to. And then yet here in verse 13 he says, but this is what God has given to man to do. God is the one leading people to do this. And so this pathway to sorrow is kind of the best way I could describe this. This pathway to sorrow, Solomon says, it is given by God. And so this is a curious thing. I want to quote Kidden here, and then we'll close with Romans 8, because I think in that we see the answer. But to quote Kidner, he said, he sees the restlessness of life, which any observer could report, but he traces it to the will of God. It is God who has given it to humanity's sons and daughters. Now he says this, at worst, it would imply that there was sense, not the nonsense of chance, behind our situation, even if the sense were wholly daunting. But it can equally well chime in with the purposeful discipline which God imposed upon us as the sequel to the fall. In other words, this pathway to sorrow, again, to borrow the phrase, this pathway to sorrow, this quest of worldly wisdom, God has granted us that pathway to lead us to the expectation of finding what I'm going to tell you, and we see in the book of Romans, hope, of finding hope. And so it's this interesting thing. So let's close with Romans chapter 8. And you're going to see here that Paul actually borrows some of the language of Ecclesiastes as he's writing here in Romans chapter 8, starting in verse 18. And so Romans chapter 8, verse 18, it says, for I reckon that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory which shall be revealed in us. And then look at verse 19. For the earnest expectation of the creature, and by creature he means creation, for the earnest expectation of the creature waiteth for the manifestation of the sons of God. For the creature was made subject to vanity. And so there you see he's using the same language. For the creature was made subject to vanity, not willingly, but by reason of him who has subjected the same, look at this, in hope. Because the creature itself also shall be delivered from the bondage of corruption into the glorious liberty of the children of God. For we know that the whole creation groaneth and travaileth in pain together until now. And then he adds us into this equation. And not only they, but ourselves also, which have the first fruits of the Spirit. Even we ourselves groan within ourselves, waiting for the adoption, to wit, the redemption of our body. For we are saved, here he says it again, by hope. But hope that is seen is not hope. For what a man seeth, why doth he yet hope for? But if we hope for that we see not, then do we with patience wait for it. In other words, again, this pathway to sorrow that so many people set upon to try and figure out life and what does it mean and why do people suffer and all these questions that people ask. If they go through this quest honestly and open their eyes and will accept the truths that creation itself will point them to, which is that at the end of the road, it's not a godless existence. At the end of the road, secularism has lied to them every step of the way. And when they get to that, they see, oh, it's not just hopeless. No, there is a creator. There is someone out there who's drawing me to him. And that realization is the only one in this world that actually brings hope. And so in a strange way, the book of Ecclesiastes, which so many people see as a skeptical book, as a book of depression and kind of thing. No, it's honestly, it's a book that's trying to bring people to a place of hope. That's what the book is trying to do. And so when we let the preacher speak, and understand the perspective from which he is speaking, the arguments then fall in place, and it makes a whole lot of sense. And so, like I said, from that end, the book of Ecclesiastes becomes incredibly, incredibly relevant for a incredibly depressed and hopeless society. And so they've got to be able to see the truth of the Creator. Creation is a theme that Solomon will talk about a lot in this book. And so we'll see that as we move forward. But I'm excited. I mean, like I said, this is a book that just personally, I haven't spent just a ton of time in, other than just, reading, daily reading or whatever. I've never really got into it and studied it with any depth. And so I'm excited to continue this